Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and a real privilege to welcome you all to this debate between a very special panel of speakers on India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And the theme is, how can peace be assured between these conflicting national identities and states? First of all, I do want to express my deep gratitude and the gratitude of the Australia-India Institute to the director of the Festival of Ideas, Patrick McKee, and to the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Professor Glyn Davis. Like most of you, I was too looking forward to Glyn chairing the session in his masterly fashion, but when Patrick told me that the Vice-Chancellor wanted me to take his place, there was no way I could say no. In India, it is said that only the most reckless or the suicide-prone would say no to a vice-chancellor, especially if you're in the university system. And unless I learn differently from my experience in Australia, I shall follow that dictum. Having said that, let me say that the Festival Ideas, as all of us who experienced the lectures and the presentations and the panels can testify, has been really a great success and a wonderful celebration of the diversity of ideas in Australia and across the world. And I must say it is really a true gift to the people of Melbourne. And the theme of the festival is particularly relevant to our debate today. There are few regions in the world, and I know that you heard a debate earlier in the day in the Middle East, but even then, there are few regions in the world where violence, identity, conflict coalesce together with the same starkness or the same intensity as they have done in South Asia, in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan for most of the last 65 years or so. And ironically, there are few regions in the international system whose future has been as difficult to predict as of South Asia. And I say this in the presence of some of the most eminent South Asian watchers, but unfortunately, most of the understanding and analysis of India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan has suffered from what anthropologists would say is an ethnocentric Western bias, whereby most analysts have tried to capsule the problems of South Asia and understanding of South Asia into a preconceived Western mold. Unfortunately, Occidental attempts, if you'd like to call it that, at forcing an Eastern intellectual puzzle into preconceived categories has just not worked. Take the case of the India-Pakistan relationship, arguably the single most important relationship in South Asia. As all of you know, the conflict between these two countries has been easy to describe, but painfully difficult to understand. And we've also seen how apparently well-thought-out prescriptions have failed, even as policy analysts from Washington, London, and other countries have invented catchy titles for this troubled relationship. Enduring rivalry, sustained conflict, ugly stability are certainly some of the terms that I have come across in my readings, especially American readings on South Asia. But this really is reduction to the point of absurdity, and it's evident to everyone who has more than just a passing sense of history of the region. Not surprisingly, today we can see that most of the policies articulated in Washington have failed or are failing. Pakistan is one of the highest recipients of American aid, and yet Osama bin Laden is more popular than Barack Obama in most parts of Pakistan. After 10 years of spending billions of dollars and having foot soldiers in almost every part of Afghanistan, it's clear that if what Barack Obama has promised, that American, NATO, and IASF soldiers walk out of Afghanistan, the Taliban will probably return into power within days, if not weeks. And India remains resistant to most outside attempts at mediation, facilitation, or interference. In other words, it's quite clear that not only is there limited understanding of South Asia, despite the shelves of books that have been written to it, but that policies based on this understanding have just not worked. We have today a very distinguished, as I said, panel of speakers who are going to try and see what are the possibilities of making peace in South Asia, whether it's possible to transcend, overcome these national conflicting identities and create at least stability in the future. We begin with Dr. Christopher Snedden, who is a leading expert of South Asia, who's worked also extensively on my home region of Jammu and Kashmir. He is the Dean of Navitas College and is an independent strategic analyst. He's going to give us a broad overview of national identity, conflict, violence, South Asia, and he will try and do that in 10 minutes. But I hope that after our panel has spoken, I'll be able to, as the chair, as the director of the festival has encouraged me to do, be as provocative, stir up some trouble, and let's be as robust and as volatile as the region that we are discussing. Dr. Snedden, please, the floor is yours.
Map number 4, please. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor Mattu, for that introduction. If we're going to be volatile, I hope you've all got your nuclear protection gear on, because remembering that both India and Pakistan each have about 100 nuclear weapons, and as Professor Evans last night said, he believes that it's a very volatile relationship. I think it's actually quite a stable relationship because they know one another quite well, and really it's a relationship that fluctuates from cold to ice cold and anything in between. It's not terribly warm, but because of that, fairly stable. Now, I just want to turn this on its head. Unfortunately, that's not very clear, but you get the idea. This is South Asia looking from Nepal. And the answer to the question, how can peace be assured between these conflicting national identities and states, is actually very easy. It can't be assured. So now we've got an early mark. Away you go. You've had the session. Thank you very much for coming. That said, I'm going to speak very quickly and give you lots of information about the region. I'm not going to talk about identity per se. I'm going to leave that to the other three speakers who are going to talk about India, Pakistan and Afghanistan respectively. But to give you some flavour of some of the issues that impact on this identity. Now, there is a region called South Asia, and in terms of its identity, it's rather weak. They do have an association, and they've had that since 1985, called the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which comprises Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, listed alphabetically because if you put India first, that antagonises everybody else, etc., etc. That's one of the dynamics of the identity of that region, that India separates all of the other nations of South Asia until Afghanistan joined in 2005, and it's now part of South Asia, but also straddles Southwest Asia because of the Iranian influence, and Central Asia because of having borders with Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and beyond that, Russia, of course. So South Asia as a region is quite poor. Could we have map number 3, please? Now, this is a UN map. Again, sorry, it's not terribly clear, but it's a UN map that's apolitical, and these are the nations of South Asia. But one of the things that I'm talking about in terms of an identity, it's interesting that today we're talking about India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. In a sense, the West and us Occidentalists, and I'm an accidental Occidental, I just happened to reincarnate into Australia this birth, so sorry about that. Maybe I was an Orientalist last birth, who knows. But in terms of this part of the world, we've now got an area that I'm calling Western South Asia, which is what the West is focusing on. In other words, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, for a whole variety of reasons. The growing clout, economically particularly, of India and its maritime aspirations and ability to protect sea lines of communication. The role of the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, 46 coalition members, trying to stabilise Afghanistan and defeat terrorism, particularly Al-Qaeda, not terribly successfully in my opinion. And of course the chicken in the middle, the chicken in the sandwich, you can't say it's a ham because it's an Islamic nation of course, is Pakistan. And Pakistan is highly important because of what's happening in Afghanistan and because of its, in my opinion, diabolical relationship with India. They don't have a good relationship, they have a number of issues, and that's part of what we'll talk about today. But out of that comes these three nations, which I'm saying is Western South Asia. A little bit like the concept of North and South that Gareth Evans mentioned last night. So these are the significant nations for the West. The others, the lesser nations, are essentially lesser nations. They're not strategically important to the West. That said, the sleeping player in the whole issue is China, which does and continues to develop good relations with these places, particularly the maritime ones, and it's looking to protect its sea lines of communication, etc., etc. So this entity, Western South Asia, is what we're talking about today. Now, in terms of some of the aspects of national identity within this, and this is again a fairly brief and quick sketch, before Western colonialism, the usual route into the subcontinent was via Afghanistan through a couple of passes there, the famous Khyber Pass, which you may have heard of, and another one called the Bolan Pass near Quetta, and some minor ones as well. The Afghans claim that they've never been defeated by anybody. It's a piece of propaganda because they have been defeated. The Persian Empire at times controlled Afghanistan for long periods of time. Alexander the Great, of course, went through there a long time ago, 300 BC, but he defeated them, and there wasn't really an Afghan identity at that stage. But more recently, the first of the great Mughals, Babur, had consolidated his kingdom in Kabul and moved from there into the subcontinent. So yes, certainly the British and the Soviet Union did suffer at the hands of the Afghans, but they have been controlled and defeated before. But it is a very old entity, as is India. But Pakistan, in the middle, is a newer identity, and that's part of the issue, that it suffers from a not, in my opinion, very strong identity, whereas India and Afghanistan are fairly strong and have better connections with one another than they do individually with Pakistan. The Afghans are a little bit scathing of the Pakistanis. They think they're a Johnny-come-lately. They don't accept the border. They didn't support Pakistan's entry to the UN in 1947. And they think they're a little bit better, perhaps, than the Pakistanis. India, of course, suffers from being the large player in the region. And along with that comes a degree of, perhaps, assertiveness, or if you like, a synonym for that, arrogance, which does create problems for the smaller nations of South Asia. And Pakistan is really the only one of those smaller nations who've got the military clout, not necessarily any other clout, but the military clout with which to oppose Indian hegemony. And that is also part of the issue. But in terms of the identity, Pakistan is an acronym in which the A stands for Afghania, which means these Pakhtuns along that border that Afghanistan doesn't accept. So in a sense, it's the link, because the K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir, and it's short for Jammu and Kashmir, but the major part of that from which Kashmir takes its popular name is the Kashmir Valley, which India controls and which Pakistan would like and feels to some extent or another incomplete with. So that's again part of the identity. Karachi's typically been the port for Afghanistan, but that's changed now too, because India with Iran has developed a port over here called Chabahar, and about a third of Afghanistan's imports are going into Afghanistan via that route, another third via Tajikistan, and Karachi is still important, but lesser so. The other aspect in terms of the region is that Pakistan, because of its diabolical relationship with India, seeks a thing called strategic depth in Afghanistan. In other words, it wants a stable Afghanistan so it doesn't have to worry about its backyard. But equally, in times of war, it feels that it might be able to move some military assets there to keep them away from Indian control, particularly aircraft. So there's that aspect as well. But it's one of the issues of that, of course, is Pakistan is reluctant to move forces westward to do all of these things that ISAF wants it to do along the border here. For example, particularly controlling Taliban in the federally administered tribal areas who seek and obtain sanctuary there. And the Pakistanis in their defence would say, well, we've sent 150,000 troops up there and we've had 3,000 casualties. So And I think Amitabh's right, actually. We don't understand the Pakistani position on this. Pakistan is terribly concerned about India, and they want assets, human and otherwise, who can shore up their position in Afghanistan and vis-a-vis India, which is why they're reluctant to do things to the so-called good Taliban. Now, the good Taliban depend on where you sit in the equation. There's Taliban in Afghanistan, there's Taliban in Pakistan. Some are good, some are not so good. Obviously, those opposing ISAF are bad. But if you're a Pakistani, you want some of those either Taliban or associated groups like the Haqqani network, who've supported you previously and who will support you again when ISAF inevitably leaves, as I think the Pakistanis believe they will, and 2014 seems to be the date. And when they do leave, what's going to be there? An unstable Afghanistan, a Pakistan devoid of the US support, because traditionally, when the US leaves the region, they forget about Pakistan to a large extent, and they're focused on India. So they're all of those sort of things that are impacting on the region. The other one is the role of Islam. This is actually a sort of a unifying force in a sense, because the Islamic Republic of Pakistan is one of the largest Islamic, in terms of population, nations in the world, probably the second after Indonesia. India has a similar number, maybe a few million left, but they're diluted by the overwhelming majority of other folk, about 80% of whom are Hindus. And Afghanistan is actually 99% Islam, but that is a problem in itself, because which Islam are we talking about? There are various strands of Islam, and that's an ongoing issue within Pakistan, that the more moderates are being intimidated by the less moderates, in other words, the hardline folk. It's to some extent an issue in Afghanistan with the Taliban there as well, who are obviously and clearly motivated by fairly hardline Islam. And in India, it's not so much of an issue. But it's a unifier to some extent in terms of identity. Currently, some of the other things that we need to consider in terms of this region, and there are some positives. One positive is the possibility of getting energy from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and Pakistan to India, which would be a great thing to do, because it would be supplying these two countries, particularly and India in particular, with its great energy needs, but also it would make Pakistan feel more secure, because then there's less of a reason for India to attack Pakistan if there's a pipeline supplying energy. Similarly, another concept is to bring a pipeline across from Iran via Pakistan to India, which would again do the same things as the TAPI, as it's called, TAPI, as against IPI pipeline. So TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Iran, Pakistan, India. The other issue, though, and this is one that's bubbling up, and that's the issue of water. Pakistan now is suffering significant water scarcity per capita. In fact, is considered to be severe, and one of the aspects of that is that the population grows, but the amount of water is fairly finite. There are some efficiencies that can be gained by better cropping and by better usage of water and those sort of things, but the population continues to grow, and every year you add 1 million, that means you have a cup less per person, etc., etc. The other issue is that Afghanistan and particularly India are in the upstream position, and Pakistan fears that India is doing things to manipulate the water, or will do it, and at some stage will turn the water off, perhaps. But downstream, down here at the bottom of the Indus, there's major problems there because it's not getting sufficient water to flush it, and so on. So that's another issue. Another issue regionally, it's not so much because of Afghanistan, but is the nuclear issue. And I said, I hope you've got your nuclear jackets on, because they do have a large number of nuclear weapons, each nation. Pakistan is developing more as we speak, and may actually have a larger nuclear arsenal than India's. And that is an issue. If there is some sort of a conflict, will that go nuclear? In 2001, when the Indian Parliament was attacked by terrorists, it looked like India and Pakistan were going to go to war. And General Musharraf, who was then the president, made it quite clear that if Pakistan's back was to the wall, then India could expect that Pakistan would use nuclear weapons. And the regional significance of that, in terms of not only West and South Asia, but South Asia generally, is horrendous, and the fallout would go right throughout Southeast Asia and apparently would reach as far as Northern Australia. It's not something to be welcomed or even seriously contemplated. It is a horrendous possibility, but it is something that if you're in South Asia, you're living with on a daily basis. And I was terribly concerned about nuclear weapons being a problem in the 1980s, and as Professor Evans said last night, there's the equivalent of about 150,000 nuclear weapons still out there. So this is one of the places where there is considered to be major problems, and arguably the seat of that problem is the Kashmir dispute. Now, we could spend weeks, months, years talking about Kashmir, but there is a school of thought that believes if India and Pakistan can resolve the Kashmir dispute, then that will help India-Pakistan relations to normalise and perhaps even improve. One aspect of that would be Pakistan may feel more secure and in turn would feel less likely to meddle in Afghanistan. Equally, India, which competes with Pakistan and other nations in Afghanistan, may be a little bit more circumspect as well. So there's that aspect as well. But unfortunately, I don't see any solution to the Kashmir dispute on the horizon in the immediate future. So some speculation about how peace can be assured between these conflicting national identities and states. Well, the shorter answer is it can't be assured, so thank you very much for coming. But there are some things that we can consider to normalise relations, to seek and resolve all major issues. Both of those are far easier said than done, and after the Mumbai terrorist incidents a few years ago, India and Pakistan haven't really re-engaged in a thing called the composite dialogue, where they were discussing 8 various topics, which included almost everything except for really the water issue. But they've already got a treaty that's worked quite well on the water treaty since about 1960 on the water issue. Western involvement, great idea, but again, it's an Occidental solution to an Oriental problem. And we know quite clearly that the Pakistanis dislike the Americans. The average Pakistani either dislikes them or is distrustful of the Americans. They're fair weather friends, history would suggest that. Certainly the Afghans, who claim to be xenophobic and don't like any foreign intrusions, although the Americans are talking about having an ongoing presence there to some extent or another after 2004, really don't want Western involvement. And India has always said to the world, we're India, we'll do it our way. We'll have a relationship with the Soviet Union, if you like. We'll have a non-aligned movement, and we'll also be friends with the US and whoever we want to. And to that extent, I think India is difficult to influence. So Western involvement is unpopular with locals. One possibility is trade and economic development, and there is a South Asian Free Trade Association, but it's very limited. There's just not the infrastructure. Between India and Pakistan, there's 1 land crossing for trucks and 2 for railways, and to get between both nations is rather difficult. And when I was doing my PhD, to get from Muzaffarabad, the capital of Azad Kashmir, which is about 4 hours by road from Srinagar, it actually takes you anything from 24 hours to 48 hours when you go back to Islamabad and down to Lahore and cross the border and get up to Jammu and fly to Srinagar, etc. And the communications and the infrastructure between them is very poor. And trade and economic development is one possibility, but it requires Pakistan to grant India most favoured nation status, and for India to be a little bit more generous, and for everybody to actually piggyback and be prepared to piggyback on Indian economic growth. Yes, encourage reasonable and democratic forces is also a great idea, but again, that's a Western solution to a local problem. Arguably, one of the problems in Afghanistan is that they've got a presidential system that concentrates power, when really you want a system that disperses power through a nation that's always had a sort of a strong centre, but power dispersed throughout the nation. So democracy is not necessarily the solution. A third-party event that may unify them, such as a natural calamity, a tsunami, difficult because Afghanistan's not on the sea, of course, but there may be other natural calamities like an earthquake or something like that, or a third-party attack. If China woke up one morning and said, we're going to attack India, Pakistan and Afghanistan, they presumably would bury the hatchet fairly quickly and get their acts together, but that's unlikely to happen either. South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation is a weak organisation, and I don't think it can do much, although it's good that all 8 nations do get together from time to time. They're supposed to meet annually, but they don't always meet annually because often one Prime Minister or another will say, I'm not going because of what's happened in Mumbai or some other particular reason. And finally, I think what will keep the peace is perhaps nuclear weapons, because, as I've suggested, the cost of going to war and having a nuclear weapon involved, and it would only take 1 or 2, would be absolutely devastating. So I haven't addressed the issues of identity so much, but it gives you some sort of a flavour about some of the issues that we're talking about, and I'm sure that Robin, Samina and Sally will enlarge on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for a very insightful overview of all the issues that the region is grappling with. I thought I'll identify one issue that you did not raise, but which is important, which is demography. While the rest of the world is aging, South Asia has the largest pool of young people. By 2020, you'll have about 600 million young people in South Asia under the age of 25. Properly trained, educated, skilled, they could be the workforce for the whole world. But unskilled, untrained, they could contribute, as they are doing today, to tremendous social unrest. So demography, or the demographic dividend in which way it plays out, is going to play a huge role in the future of South Asia. Having said that, our next speaker is someone who's really well known in Melbourne. In the last month and a half that I have been here, he's been variously described as the father of Indian studies in Australia, or the uncle, as my colleague John Webb described him, as the uncle of Indian studies, and by some true secularists as the patron saint of Indian studies in India. Robin Jeffrey is the emeritus professor at La Trobe and ANU and is currently visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies and the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He has a special interest in the politics of media, development and pluralism in India and South Asia. He's lived in India as a school teacher and completed a doctorate from Sussex on India, and I understand that he can speak several Indian languages fluently. It's a great privilege to have Robin speak on India and South Asia. Robin.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. I'm only sorry some of that weren't true. It would be nice if it were, particularly the fluency in Indian languages. I've struggled with Indian languages for a long time. I feel a little constrained about speaking here on this particular topic today, partly because in Professor Mathu and Professor Yasmin, we've got two people here who are intimately informed about the politics and the nature of both of Pakistan in the case of Professor Yasmin and India, and particularly Kashmir in the case of Professor Mathu. Professor Mathu is a Kashmiri himself. He's been vice-chancellor of a university in Kashmir. In recent times, he's been party to and understands the issues from the Indian perspective on Kashmir and cannot but have opinions based on family and his own experience. Similarly, Professor Yasmin. So I have to say I'm looking forward to hearing them talk and perhaps the audience and our panel engage with them in discussion because there's a great deal to elicit from them, it seems to me. My own experience and my role here, I think, is to somehow put some sort of an Indian position, an Indian identity position. And I think the best way I can do that is to try to explain to you how I encountered an Indian position long, long ago. In fact, on the 4th of July, 1959, if some of you remember the glorious 1950s when the world was safe and only had to worry about mutual assured destruction in the Cold War, and so much more predictable place than it is today. I know the date because I went back to my diary. I was, as well as being a little imperialist, I was an imperialist and a cold warrior when I was 14. And I was also a diarist, so I know the precise day that this happened. From the time I was about 12, like a lot of people, I guess I became interested in current affairs, and clearly Kashmir was an issue then. I remember seeing V.K. Krishna Menon at the United Nations on live television in the days when Security Council debates were shown live on North American television. This was in Western Canada in my case. Krishna Menon, of course, was the man who looked like the kind of wild professor with the shocks of white hair flying back and the prominent nose and the very vigorous kind of rhetoric that went on for hours and hours and hours and interfered with the sportscasts on television. But it nevertheless made an impact on me. Krishna Menon, of course, presenting the Indian case on Kashmir to the United Nations. And I went into the matter at that point and read about as much as I could as a kid at school, and I concluded that the Indians didn't have much of a case. It was a pretty shonky case. Kashmir was predominantly Muslim in population. Pakistan had been founded as a homeland for the Muslims of South Asia. Then what was all the carry-on about India being in Kashmir? And that was my position on the 3rd of July, 1959. But then I had an encounter with an uncle. My father's eldest brother had gone to India from Scotland as a young planter in 1907 to South India. And he'd been a coffee planter in South India all his life. And he'd made a decent life out of that, growing coffee. And in 1959, as he was then a man in his 70s, he came to visit all his relatives, all of whom had gone to Canada. That was the only time I really ever met him. And he, on the 4th of July, 1959, was in Victoria, British Columbia, and I was sitting with him after dinner at a relative's, and I casually said to him, well, of course, the Indians should get out of Kashmir at once, shouldn't they? And he looked at me, and he was a very Pakka Sahib. He didn't really have much time for Indian independence or Mahatma Gandhi or the Indian freedom struggle, indeed, very little time at all. But he looked at me and said, no, that's not right. Don't you understand the Indian position on all this? And then he went on, this very kind of British Saab, to explain to me the Indian position with which he had considerable sympathy. And it went something like this. It was, do you know that Kashmir, and could we have number 2, please, if number 2 would be quite good. The white bit on the map you see in front of you, that was the old Kashmir ruled by the Maharaja of Kashmir. Those top ears, the left ear and the right ear, the 2 corners, not really very inhabited, very mountainous if you ever look at a physical map of the region. But that was the area notionally ruled by the Maharaja of Kashmir, who was a prince in subsidiary alliance with the British government. And he said to me, don't you know that the Maharaja of Kashmir was a Hindu? And I said, no, I didn't really. And he said, do you know what happened in 1947? And I said, well, no, I mean, what happened? They fought. And the Indians tried to snatch this big chunk of this princely state that has a whole lot of Muslims living in it. Isn't that what happened? He said, well, no, not really. The Maharaja of Kashmir, when the British left, had the right to choose whether he was going to join India or Pakistan. And at one point, he was invaded by people coming from the Pakistan side. He got terrified and he joined India. And the Indians sent soldiers and they fought at that point. And the line you see on this map, he didn't have a map to show me, but the line that's marked there as the line of control is roughly where the fighting stopped in 1949. So the Indians, he said, have a very good legal position on Kashmir by international law. The ruler of that territory joined with India in 1947. The Indians sent troops to maintain a piece of territory that had legally acceded to them. And subsequently, India has had elections in Kashmir, and the people have voted for governments that are roughly democratically elected. And, he went on, and look at Pakistan. Last year it had a military coup. It's a military dictatorship. Did you know that? So that's how I discovered an Indian position on Kashmir, that in Indian eyes, in Indian terms, and even in the terms of elderly Brits who had retired to India, he lived in Bangalore at that time, even in the eyes of elderly Brits, Kashmir was a legitimate legal part of India. And of course, that's the Indian position even today, that this was a legal accession in 1947. There have been various electoral processes of one kind or another, and Kashmir belongs to India. And the question Christopher referred to, if you look on the left and northern side of that line, that's what Christopher just referred to as Azad Kashmir. And of course, if the Indian government were represented here today, somebody would put up their hand and say, that is incorrectly referred to, that's POK, Pakistan Occupied Kashmir. So we have these terrible kind of linguistic disputes over what things should be called and where boundaries ought to be portrayed on maps. That was my discovery of an Indian position, and that Indian position, I've subsequently learned, of course, is part of an identity of an Indian state as it has developed over the last 50 years. And that is an Indian state that, in theory at least, and in its best case expression, is secular. It recognizes the state, recognizes no distinction between religions. It treats all its citizens equally, no matter what their gender or their language or their religion. And that this Indian secular state will not lose bits of itself, because modern sovereign states don't let bits of themselves go. Just as Abraham Lincoln fought a war to preserve the Union, so the government of India will fight and struggle to preserve the Union of India, where all Indians are equal regardless of their religious affiliations. So it is an important part of Indian identity. The tragedy, of course, in this particular dispute is that this place, Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, is an integral part, too, of Pakistan identity. Again, as Christopher said, embodied in that letter K in the acronym Pakistan. K is for Kashmir. The Economist last month, the 21st of May edition of The Economist that many of you will have seen, has as its cover story a discussion of just this question, the India-Pakistan dispute, particularly at this top of the world. And the tag on the cover story is "The World's Most Dangerous Border." And the portrayal, the artist's graphic portrayal on the cover of The Economist, is two rather temple-like looking structures that simply bristle with guns and tanks and bombs and nuclear weapons. It is probably the most dangerous border in the world, because I think it's the only one where the antagonists on both sides do have nuclear weapons. The problem from the Indian point of view today is, or the advantage that India enjoys, is that India in the last 20 years has increasingly enjoyed the rhetoric of business presses throughout the English-speaking world that proclaim India as a great and growing economy, and that India is on the brink of becoming a great power in the sorts of great power terms that we used in reference to Europe at the end of the 19th century, when Germany became a great power, Britain was a great power. India, we're told, if we read our business pages closely, is becoming a great power. The Economist pointed out that India is roughly 8 times larger than Pakistan. Its economy is growing far faster than Pakistan's. 8% a year, just a little under 8% last year, is a fairly average economic growth figure for India over the last 15 years. Huge markets to be exploited here, huge economic muscle that will increasingly be developed and capable of engaging with anyone who wishes to mess with India. So one is not likely to see huge concessions on an Indian side to placate a Pakistan state that seems increasingly unpredictable and indeed divided within and among itself. India, by the same token, has its own problems or its own opportunities. As a democracy, there are certain things Indian governments can and cannot do. The current Indian government is about halfway through its term, and I think it's probably safe to say it's an exhausted government. It's a government that lurches from one crisis to another, trying to manage those crises. So we're unlikely to see on foreign policy fronts any major confident initiatives from India to resolve a Kashmir dispute in the short term. What we will see, though, could we see number 1, please? Number 1 isn't all that clear to us, but what it should show is the position of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan in Asia as a whole. At the moment, today, if you can see where my pointer is jumping around, in Astana in Kazakhstan, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is meeting. That's an organization of the Central Asian states, China and Russia. It's a particularly interesting organization because it is seeking to tap the natural resources and growing political influence of the countries of Central Asia. India is hopeful of becoming a member of the SCO, and that looks as if it may happen in the next couple of years. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization may provide a vehicle that allows a Pakistan, Afghanistan, India resolution to occur simply because it comes at the problem from a rather different perspective. Rather than from a perspective of the West or coming up from the South, it's a little bit like the map Christopher showed earlier of turning South Asia on its head. Well, to approach the problems of Kashmir, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, from Central Asia, with China and Russia as major players, may offer just a few more opportunities for other solutions to antagonism between India and Pakistan. But India, as a democracy, will always have to sell whatever agreements it may come to at meetings such as the one in Astana, if such a meeting were to be repeated in 2 or 3 years with Kashmir, Pakistan, India on the agenda. India would still have to sell that to an electorate, and the chances are it will be difficult for a centrist kind of Indian government to do that. It's more likely that a government that could sell such settlements will be a right-wing, rather more Hindu chauvinist kind of government that might take those sorts of risks and be able to sell them to an Indian electorate. India, too, of course, is immensely diverse, just as the whole region is. Could we have number 8, please? Number 8 captures just a little bit of this. It's a linguistic map of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and eastern Iran. The purple part of the map are areas in which the Baluchi language is spoken. And as you'll see, Baluch are to be found in Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. The yellowy-greeny is the Sindhi language, which is also spoken in India. The brown one is Punjabi, again spoken in India, Pakistan. And the dark green one, of course, is Pushtu, spoken in Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's just one indication of the kind of complexities of religion and language that you'll find in this northwestern section of South Asia. So the difficulties of such diverse populations in religion, language, and the problems over boundaries are formidable. The solutions are not particularly obvious, though talking to someone recently, and it would be interesting to hear the views of people in this audience, someone was suggesting to me maybe a Cyprus solution is possible. Cyprus has a northern portion which the world doesn't recognize, but which is nevertheless a Turkish majority section of the island of Cyprus, and a southwestern portion, which is overwhelmingly Greek, which the world does recognize. Apparently, Cypriots move back and forth across the line of control fairly freely, and there's a kind of mutual understanding that we the Turks, we the Greeks, won't make too much fuss about the legal aspects of the arrangement we have. Let's come up with something that's workable for us on both sides of these imaginary lines, because ordinary people have to make their lives by either working with or against boundaries imposed by modern nation states. Perhaps such a solution is foreseeable in Kashmir in the next 10 years, given a whole lot of other favorable circumstances, which we might go into the course of discussion. And whether such a solution is practicable, again, Professor Matu's opinion on such things would be, I think, particularly interesting and valuable for this meeting. So that's probably a good place for me to stop with an explanation of my discovery of how Kashmir, the northern portions of South Asia, fit into an Indian identity. And we can then move on to perhaps Professor Yasmin and hear from her.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that very incisive presentation on India. May I now request Professor Samina Yasmin, who's the director of the Center for Muslim States and Societies and lectures in political science and international relations in the School of Social and Cultural Studies at the University of Western Australia, Perth. Samina is a member of the Australian Multicultural Advisory Council. She's also a member of the Ministerial Council for Immigration Services and Status Resolution, a board member of the National Australia Day Council, a member again of the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, Canberra. She also serves on the Community Consultative Committee of the National Center of Excellence in Islamic Studies, Melbourne University, and is one of the most distinguished and well thought of analysts on South Asia, in Australia, and internationally. She's going to speak on Pakistan, issues of identity and conflict. Samina.
Thank you very much, Professor Mattu. I think one problem with introductions is that it certainly raises the bar. So you wonder as you walk towards the lectern whether you're going to come up to that or not. I guess I'll suggest that the fact that there's so many boards that I go to, what it tells you is that I hardly sit down and think, which means that I can't really make any contribution to understanding Pakistan. But let me try and make my contribution to this session. I'd like to approach the whole issue of Pakistan's view of how peace can be created in terms of how I see identities are created. And this notion of identity isn't just simply limited to Pakistan, it can exist anywhere. In fact, most of our research on Australian identities or Australian Muslim identities is really at the base of what I'm going to talk about. We tend to get information about our world from our family, our community, the schools we go to, the newspapers we read, and the televisions that we watch, and now the kind of mobile we carry and the kind of apps we have. All together, they give us the information about who we are and what's our relationship to the world that we live in. I think to think of identities, and in this case, Pakistani identity as something being static would really be missing the point that we're constantly in a state of dynamic evolution, changing what we are and how we relate to the world we're living in. Now, let me very quickly apply this to understanding Pakistan. It's a country of 170 million, some say 180 million, and in fact, every time I'm trying to work out how many million there are, the number adds up. And so let's roughly say it's more than 170 million people. When we're looking at identities or identities of Pakistanis, I think we can't get away from the fact that just like any other community, any human organization, Pakistanis have different understandings of what their identity is all about, which really impacts on their relationship with other Pakistanis, but also with the countries in the neighborhood and the wider world. To simplify it, I think if we were trying to look at what were the basic elements that constituted Pakistan's identity, which had an expression in its relationship with the regional and the global levels, what I would identify as three main elements. One is the search for equality. The second is the search for respect. And the third one is the need for security. And I think the search for equality really comes from a very erroneous reading of geography. Pakistan from the very beginning, because it was carved out of British India, and India inherited the mantle of the word India, and Pakistan created a new identity, has worked on the assumption that because we were all together, therefore we are equal. So Pakistan has constantly worked on this assumption that whatever happens in terms of geography, in reality, Pakistani identity is equal to that of the Indian identity. And that it's the responsibility of the Indian government as well as anyone else to accept that equality and base their relationships on that recognition. I think very closely linked to this idea of equality is that Pakistan deserves and expects respect in its capacity as a major partner in South Asia, and therefore at the global level as well. But related to that is also the question of security. Despite sort of expecting this acceptance of equality, I think Pakistanis from the very beginning have suffered from this fear of insecurity, mainly from the eastern neighbor, India, and most of their policies were structured and still continue to be structured around this need to ensure that they are secure. But when I give you these three words, equality, respect, and security, I guess what I'd like to point out is that while in the initial phase of Pakistan's existence, in fact, even after the breakup of Pakistan and creation of Bangladesh, these three elements had more or less a unanimity of views among Pakistanis. What we find is that from the late 1970s, Pakistani understanding of what it all means has really gone through a change. Islamization, which Chris talked about, basically changed the way a certain part of Pakistani community started looking at its identity and what it means in terms of its foreign policy. Now, you could argue that this way of looking wasn't new. It wasn't unique in Pakistan because soon after 47, these understandings were playing their part as well, but they were at the periphery. But from the late 70s and definitely 1980s onwards, the rise of Islamization in Pakistan in the society has created groups, some of them supported by the government agencies and some of them who have grown out as a result of them learning about Islam, that have given a very different meaning to what it means to be an equal, have respect, and have security. The notion of equality for these Islamist groups has actually been thrown out of the picture. They look at the world from a very focused notion of Islamic identity. And that gives them a sense that Pakistan as a nation of Muslims, ignoring the fact that there are other religions as well, does not have to be treated as an equal. In fact, it is superior to anyone else that's around. There's an inbuilt sense of arrogance. I think Chris was talking about more in terms of India, but I'd say even on Pakistani side, those who focus too much on their Islamic identity, there is a risk of equating that with saying we don't need to be treated as equals. That dismissing of the equality element also leads them into the question of if you're not equal, then should you be respected? And when these groups talk about respect, and the literature that they put out suggests that, again, from their point of view, respect is not something that you expect of others. Respect grows out of you being a Muslim. So an Islamic state which follows principles of Islam, depending upon whichever different interpretations you have, gets to a stage where others have no option but to respect it, especially if it has the capacity to engage in jihad or make sure that it fights both defensive and offensive conflict vis-a-vis its enemies, whosoever they may be, and also knows that ultimately, as a Muslim, engaged in fighting, that God would be on their side and they would be successful. So I guess if I was trying to be very unfair to the Islamist point of view, and I do recognize that there are a lot of different interpretations within the Muslim community in Pakistan on what equality, respect, and security means, what we do see is that the notions of what Pakistan's identity is vis-a-vis the region and the wider world have somehow been appropriated by the Islamists in a way that is different from what was the case in the past. How do other Pakistanis, again we're talking about 170 million plus, look at this notion of equality, respect, and security in today's Pakistan? I think there's a difference of opinion within this other group as well. You find people who are either illiterate, and that comes back to the fact that definition of literacy is very loose and vague in Pakistan, or you have people who are very literate and very educated in the class that Amitabh Mathur was talking about, who could be the service providers or the leaders around the world in the next few decades. In this class, the notion of equality is being contested. There's some who say that we need to learn from geography. We need to actually understand that Pakistan is not an equal. And so we can't give up this idea of equality and just work with the notion of respect, which comes from every side accepting their position in the system. So Pakistan should be respected not because it's totally or absolutely equal to India, but it should be respected because it is a state where there are Muslims, and Muslims are trying to make a homeland of their own succeed. But they don't give up the idea of the security. And I think in this notion of security, again, you do have different interpretations of what does it mean to be secure. Some of them talk about security by establishing links, not just simply with India, but also with Afghanistan and with other countries as well. Even in terms of their relationship with America, I think there's this idea that you expect security, but it needs to grow out of a sense of respect on part of the United States vis-a-vis Pakistan. So I guess I'm trying to put it very simply to you and say, if we're looking at Pakistan today and say, what is the sense of identity and how does it impact on where the region might move from here onwards, we can't really get away from the fact that there are divisions of opinion. There is a diversity of opinion, and I think if we are to look at how this Pakistan can become a force of peace rather than a continuous conflict, we need to start accepting these realities. So to start off by, if we accept that reality, where do we go with that? I think as long as the division continues within Pakistan between those who have a very different opinion of equality, respect, and security, the Islamists, as long as they remain strong within Pakistan, the ability of Pakistani government, even those who argue that Pakistan needs to accept its position within the system, would be undermined. And I guess what I'm really pointing out is that with the best of intentions, you would see governments in Pakistan who may want to negotiate with India and even with Afghanistan, as we've seen in the past, but their ability to deliver would constantly be undermined by those who do not agree with this. Because their view of any engagement with India or any engagement with the West or even a willingness to negotiate with Afghanistan, governments supported by America would be seen as negating this principle that we don't need equality, we are superior, we don't need respect, we will earn it by using our Islamic credentials. If it was only the question of ideas, in this festival of ideas, where these people came up with these ideas and sat down and negotiated, I think picture would be different. But the sad point is that a number of these Islamist groups since the 1980s have been funded, first by everyone and then by certain sections within the Pakistan government. And then they've developed their own criminal networks through which they have acquired weapons, which increase their capacity to undermine any state initiatives to even improve links with the countries in the region. So whatever the government may wish, I think their capacity to change is limited. So if we, do I have another 3 minutes? I just want, okay. If that's the sort of starting point, that whatever you do, you'd come across these Islamists who may undermine your ability to establish links, positive links in the region, where do we go? Does this mean that the other group, not the Islamist group, has to give up? I think that group has a huge responsibility. So you couldn't really create conditions of peace unless and until those who are not hooked on this idea of Islamic identity translated in negative terms, those who are not hooked on that idea, they take the matters in their own hand. But once I start talking about them taking the matters in their own hand, what I move directly into is the question of state responsibility. I think in case of Pakistan, and it's not only the Islamists or the non-Islamists, in case of Pakistan, the culture has created an understanding that those who come to power, they treat power as being unaccountable. They hold power because they think it's absolute under their control. State responsibility or notions of state responsibility will have to change for those who want to change Pakistan, and it would have to change in a way where the state becomes servant of the people and not the rulers of the people. Now, you might think that that has got nothing to do with the question of peace and security, but I think even the debates and the struggle within Pakistan between the Islamists and the others have often focused on the question of how do we run the system and create conditions that make lives of people comfortable. And it's always been pointed out that those who don't believe in Islam are the ones who are unable to provide the basic necessities of the people because they're too busy ruling. So I think the state and its view of itself and relationship with the people will have to change. But is the responsibility of peace solely a responsibility of the Pakistanis? I think if we are looking at Pakistan identity and how it sees its world, we can't get away from the fact that irrespective of the divisions, there is a very strong feeling that India has not accepted Pakistan's identity. Now, you could argue that a lot of Indians have accepted Pakistan's existence and identity. But I think it's always mixed with this sense of glee and sometimes, and that's where I'd agree with Chris, a sense of arrogance which when it's interpreted in Pakistan, it turns into Indian commitment to undo Pakistan. Now, the problem is that the messages start off with one intention and then they get misinterpreted and really magnified in a totally negative sense. But if we are to break that cycle, I think India needs to move into a space where it accepts the need for respect for Pakistan, irrespective of Pakistan's weaknesses and the problems. But there's another change that I think we need to focus on, and that is the willingness of the Indians, Pakistanis, and the Afghans to accept that actually we are part of one region. Whatever starts in one point of the region can impact on another point of the region. Unless and until that realization is accepted and promoted by those who are willing to promote, I don't think we would be really moving into a peace area. Now, where's the responsibility of the third parties in this? I'll quickly just focus on two and maybe we can discuss that. In terms of third parties, I think we've often equated the question of third parties with the United States. The United States has a responsibility as the major external power in the region to understand the feelings of people who occupy this region. And if WikiLeaks are to be believed, I think that recognition is there partly, but I think it needs to go beyond that. The willingness to come up with the idea of AFPAC and divorce that from any consideration of what happens in India, it might suit American relationship with India, but I think from Pakistani point of view, it really undermines that expectation that Pakistan needs respect, because built in this separation is that Pakistan is the problem and therefore doesn't require that respect. So I think Americans need to change their attitude towards the region as well and be a real force of promoting understanding. But beyond that, I think countries like Australia have a responsibility. We can contribute to programs that deal with the questions that, especially in case of Pakistan, contribute to the Islamist groups coming up. In a number of cases, not all the cases, poverty is one of the reasons, and I think we could focus more than we have, and I'm glad that there is definitely a move in that direction, but move more in the direction of trying to support these people so that their ability to be taken in by Islamist propaganda is undermined. And finally, the responsibility of the diaspora. I think diaspora has got, and I remember the discussion in the first session this morning, diaspora has both a right and a responsibility to be able to move beyond the discussions that hold very dominant positions in the countries or the areas of origin. When you're in that area, I think the dynamics itself makes it very hard to be neutral. When diasporic communities have to deal with that, I think they have a responsibility to become agents of peace, understanding, and try and communicate those understandings back to the countries of origin. In that, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladesh, Afghan diasporic communities here and elsewhere, I think they shoulder a responsibility. Because if anything, and I haven't talked about, when you go back into communities like Pakistan, the fear of speaking up is so great in some cases that diasporic communities probably can act without that fear and be the force of change. I hope that can sort of start some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samina, especially for your nuanced understanding of Pakistan and drawing attention to the diaspora. Our final panelist is Sally Neighbor, who's a multiple award-winning journalist and author, best known for her work with Australia's premier public affairs television program, the ABC's Four Corners, and her specialist writing with the Australian newspaper. She has authored 2 award-winning books, The Mother of Muhammad, the story of an Australian woman, Rabia Hutchinson, who spent 20 years on the front lines of the global jihadist movement in Indonesia, Egypt, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And Sally's previous book, In the Shadow of Swords, on the trail of terrorism from Afghanistan to Australia, documents the formation and evolution of the Indonesian militant group Jemaah Islamiyah and its involvement in the 2002 Bali bombings. The Shadow of Swords won the New South Wales History Prize and was named by The Economist as one of the best 25 books for 2005. Sally is currently a columnist with The Australian, and she writes on terrorism and Islamic extremism. And today she is going to speak on Afghanistan and issues of identity. Sally.
Thank you very much. I have to confess I've been feeling rather intimidated by the eminence of my fellow panellists, but I feel a little bit better after that introduction. Afghanistan, as you know, has been embroiled in war for the past decade, or for the past 3 decades, depending on how far we want to go back. And throughout that time has been the subject of intense international debate and hand-wringing among the US and its allies as they wrestle over how to remove themselves from the quagmire. And among the rest of us, as we ponder questions like when and how can Western troops withdraw from Afghanistan? Will Afghanistan collapse into civil war when they do? Can the Taliban be kept from power? Or should the Taliban be brought to the negotiating table? Can Afghanistan sustain itself after foreign forces leave? And I think the single biggest reason why these debates have proved so fruitless and so little progress has been made thus far is that we persist in examining Afghanistan in isolation, as though it exists in a vacuum in which its problems can be solved without taking into account the larger geostrategic picture into which it fits, and the crucial role of neighbours such as Pakistan and India, the key ones, and of course Iran, China and others in resolving the intractable conflict there. So I think we're definitely on the right track today in seeing Afghanistan as just part of a larger and much more complex puzzle. And let's see if we can solve that puzzle today, in which case we'll all deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. The problem of Afghanistan is a product, more than anything else, of its geostrategic location. We probably don't have quite the map up that we need up there. Maybe number 3 would be better if somebody's controlling the maps. Thank you. It's at the very heart of Asia, or as Lord Curzon, the 19th century Viceroy of British India, described it, the cockpit of Asia, a landlocked country surrounded by bellicose neighbours, all intent on bolstering their own positions. To its west is Iran, a militant Shia state, suspicious and hostile toward its Sunni Pashtun neighbours. To its north, the Central Asian republics, formerly part of the old Soviet Union, to which Afghanistan was merely a pawn in its Cold War with the West. To the east and south, of course, is Pakistan, once part of the old British Empire, which sought to colonise Afghanistan, and now a nuclear-armed Islamic State, as we've heard, which is obsessed with maintaining control to the extent that it can of Afghanistan. And beyond Pakistan, its nemesis India, to their north again, Kashmir, over which the two of them have been fighting since partition. Now, it's because of this unique position of Afghanistan that for millennia would-be conquerors have been sweeping through the region like shooting stars, in the words of the Pakistani author and journalist Ahmad Rashid. Chris mentioned Alexander the Great in the 4th century, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane. In the 20th century it was the British Imperial Army, which famously lost an entire expeditionary force of 16,000 men, save for a single survivor in its retreat through the Khyber Pass in 1942. Later again, of course, it was the mighty Soviet Union that was brought low in this empire of graveyards, as a former Afghan foreign minister once called it. And today it's the United States that is, of course, pondering its own position and how it will emerge from its long-running conflict in Afghanistan. And so to our question, how can peace be assured within these conflicting national identities and states? Well, as Chris said, of course it can't, but we'll have a go anyway. From the point of view of Afghanistan, this is perhaps the central question, because peace in Afghanistan can't be resolved or achieved without looking beyond its borders. My task here is to summarise the Afghani position, which is difficult because there is no single Afghani position. It's a country which is deeply fractured along tribal, linguistic, religious, geographic and political lines. Its body politic is a mass of conflicting positions and ever-shifting allegiances, hence the well-worn quote, "You can't buy an Afghan, you can only rent him for a while." Let's look at some of these conflicting positions. President Hamid Karzai's position is essentially to survive and retain power. The Taliban's position is to get rid of foreign forces and establish an Islamic emirate. The position of the Pashtun majority in Afghanistan is to ensure its own dominance, while the minority Tajiks, Uzbeks and Hazaras are intent on protecting and maximising their own positions. The warlords, another key stakeholder, unfortunately, who have held an important position in Afghanistan and will regrettably continue to do so, their aim is to maintain their fiefdoms and the enormous wealth that's generated by their control of poppies, taxes and natural resources. So a whole raft of conflicting positions, but I think if we examine them closely and cross-check them, it's possible to identify, excuse me, it is possible to identify some common objectives which I think we can reasonably call an Afghani position. Number one is foreign forces out. That's non-negotiable and nothing will be achieved before that happens. Number two, respect for Afghanistan's territorial integrity and sovereignty, which of course has been honoured much more in the breach over preceding decades and centuries. Another is a political and legal system based on the centrality of Islamic law. That is something that is pretty much agreed by all the parties in Afghanistan. Peaceful relations with its neighbours, particularly Pakistan. And I think it's worth noting that Afghanistan historically has not been an aggressor or even a willing participant in the grand geostrategic games that have been played out on its territory. It's largely been drawn into them reluctantly. Another common point is that any settlement must be based on power sharing, and this, I think, inevitably will include the Taliban, the warlords and the rest of the rogues gallery of opium dealers and mass murderers such as Hekmatyar Sayaf and so on, who've been at play in Afghan politics for 30 years. So it will be far from an ideal democratic system that we're going to end up with. And finally, the need for international assistance. This is something that I think, again, all parties agree is crucial. At the start of this current war, it was estimated that $12 billion was needed to rebuild Afghanistan. Of course, a lot of money has been spent, an enormous amount has been wasted, but there are billions more remaining to be spent. And as one example, it's estimated that merely to maintain the Afghan army after the foreign forces leave will require $1 billion a year. So an enormous ongoing international economic commitment will be needed. One central point that's agreed by all parties now, I think even the United States finally, is that the war in Afghanistan cannot be resolved militarily. It's very difficult to get an accurate picture at this point, or at any point really, but certainly at this point, of the current military position in Afghanistan. I think we can say that in the last 6 to 12 months, since President Obama's troop surge, the US and its allies have made some gains, but those gains are patchy, difficult to pin down, and I think there's a very big question mark over whether they're sustainable. What we do know is that this time last year, the Taliban claimed, and I emphasise claimed, to control 90% of Afghanistan. Since then, of course, there has been a major offensive, and earlier this year, in an attempt to measure the success of that offensive, General David Petraeus said that the NATO-led forces were killing or capturing 360 insurgent leaders every 3 months. Now that, of course, has problems associated with it as well. A former British ambassador to Afghanistan condemned this boast at the time as shameful and made the point that for every dead Pashtun warrior, there will be 10 pledged to revenge, which I think is a phenomenon that's been demonstrated time and time again in Afghanistan. And another problem associated with this targeting of insurgent leaders, and one that I know is occupying the minds of many analysts now, is that what's happening is that the older, more seasoned, experienced Taliban leaders are being wiped out, and their places are being taken by younger, even more radical, even more aggressive new leaders who are quite likely to be less prepared to negotiate. the leader of the Australian forces in Afghanistan, or at least the head of the Australian Defence Force, Angus Houston, is telling us that real gains are being made in Afghanistan and that it's not the time to leave. Just last week, when he was paying tribute to the 27th Australian soldier to die in Afghanistan, the 4th in 2 weeks, he made the point that very real gains were being made. We also know that in 2010, last year, civilian deaths in Afghanistan rose 28%. And this year, civilian deaths have risen again to 14%. So there are a whole lot of different parts of the picture which we can use to try and assess, the extent to which military gains have been made. But I think the main point is that whatever gains have been made, the real question is whether they can be sustained in the long term, and I think that's highly doubtful. I want to read to you very quickly an assessment from a foreign commander on the front line in Afghanistan. And I quote, "We should honestly admit that our efforts over the last 8 years have not led to the expected results. Huge material resources and considerable casualties have not produced a stabilisation. The protracted character of the struggle and the absence of any serious success has led in the minds of the majority of the population to mistrust in the abilities of the regime. The experience of the past years clearly shows that the Afghan problem cannot be solved by military means alone." That was written by a Soviet colonel, Kade Sigalov, in a briefing to the defence minister in Moscow in 1987. And I think virtually the same assessment could be made in Washington now. So as we consider how to get ourselves out of this imbroglio in Afghanistan, I think one of the key points we have to examine is the role of the Taliban, which of course is a very vexed question, and for many it's anathema to even consider that the Taliban could be part of the solution. And yet I think now it's clear that there can be no settlement without the Taliban. Indeed, the former UN Secretary-General's Special Representative to Afghanistan, or on Afghanistan, Lakhdar Brahimi, said after the international conference that was held in Bonn in November 2001 to try and put together a new government for Afghanistan. In the aftermath of that experience, he said the Taliban should have been at Bonn. This was our original sin, not having the Taliban involved in that conference. And his point that it was the failure to engage the Taliban, to negotiate a ceasefire and the demobilisation of forces that paved the way for the mess that we've been left with all these years later. So the Taliban must be engaged, and this in turn requires a very sober reassessment of the objective that the US and Australia now cite as the key rationale for remaining in Afghanistan. And General Petraeus restated it in January, and again I quote, "Our core objective here is to ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes a sanctuary for al-Qaeda or other transnational extremists." So this is what we've been told in recent years and continue to be told is the reason for the ongoing fight in Afghanistan. This argument, however, is no longer valid for either staying in Afghanistan or for casting Afghanistan as an enemy in the war on terror. And there are a number of reasons for this, some of which will be familiar to you. The most obvious one is that, as we now know, since late 2001, al-Qaeda has been based in Pakistan, not Afghanistan. The Afghan Taliban effectively split with al-Qaeda after September 11, when the Taliban blamed al-Qaeda for provoking the US attack which ousted the Taliban regime from power. And since then, the Afghan Taliban has moved to distance itself from al-Qaeda. It's condemned attacks on civilians and extended an olive branch to its adversaries and to the West. Mullah Omar said in a statement, I think it was last year, the Taliban wants to maintain good and positive relations with all neighbours and open a new chapter of good neighbourliness, mutual cooperation and economic development. Now, you may feel it's stretching credulity too far to accept that on face value, but I think we do need to remember that it wasn't Taliban that attacked the United States, it was al-Qaeda, and the Taliban itself is not a terrorist organisation. Most importantly, we need to remember that the Afghan and Pakistan Taliban are two very clearly separate entities. The agenda of the Pakistan Taliban, which is closely allied with al-Qaeda, is to attack the Pakistani state and its supporters and the West, while the Afghan Taliban has a very domestically focused agenda, which is essentially about the future governance of Afghanistan. So I think in all our considerations on this subject, we have to keep reminding ourselves that the Pakistan and Afghan Taliban are two very different creatures. So, how can we assure peace? I don't know. I do have a few suggestions, and they echo what some of my fellow panellists have said. Number one, resolve the Kashmir dispute. Someone else here will have to figure that out. Resolve or address the Afghan-Pakistan border dispute, which has been a thorn in relations between those two countries since the Durand Line was drawn between them in 1893. And as you would probably know, that whole region is known among Afghans as Pashtunistan, because the Pashtuns live on either side of that border, and to them that border is no more meaningful than a mark on a map. And so that has been an ongoing source of tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And if some progress could be resolved toward resolving that issue, I think that would help a great deal. Another suggestion I have is to support democracy and civil administration in Pakistan. Chris made the point that promoting democracy is problematic because it's a Western-imposed solution, and I agree with that, but I think Fatima Bhutto made the point when she was in Sydney recently for the Writers' Festival that the United States has supported every military dictatorship in Pakistan's history, and through doing so has been a force against democracy rather than a force for democracy in Pakistan. And Ahmed Rashid, in his fabulous book Descent into Chaos, includes some figures, which I don't have at hand here, on the enormous amount of aid, military and economic aid given to Pakistan under its military regimes compared with the much smaller amount of aid given to democratic regimes that have existed in Pakistan. So I think that could be addressed as well. Another suggestion is that we do need to engage with the Taliban, whatever position it holds in future in Afghanistan, and I'm talking about the Afghan Taliban here, to ensure, if we can, that it shuns and isolates al-Qaeda and does not allow Afghanistan to be used again as a haven for terrorists. And my final suggestion is we should learn from history and not abandon Afghanistan after the foreign forces leave in 2014. Otherwise, we'll end up with another failed state on our hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And now, for the next 15-20 minutes, Patrick, would that be okay? We'll have a conversation amongst our panelists, and then we'll open it to the audience. I thought we could get this going by my posing a couple of questions to all of you, drawing from some of the presentations that you've made, a couple of questions to all of you, and then one special question to each one of you. Chris, you talked about democracy and how democracy may not pose a solution in South Asia. And yet, for the first time, perhaps in many years, we have a democratic movement all over South Asia. Nepal, even Bhutan, there's a kind of new democracy, incipient democracy. Pakistan has a fragile democracy. Afghanistan, they say, has a corrupt democracy. India has a more mature democracy. But all countries in South Asia proclaim some form of democratic government. Now, is that something to look forward to? Do you think that could potentially mature into a relationship where conflict and war, as in the case of mature democracies elsewhere, will make war and conflict completely redundant? Question number one about the present. Question number two about the future. Do any of you, I know there's one kind of common strain of pessimism which has run through all your presentations, but having said that, is there any magic mantra or silver bullet that you can think of which could transform relations between these three countries, or indeed in the wider region? And finally, with your permission, Patrick, one provocative question, especially since I might be accused of questioning Pakistan's identity. Was the partition a mistake? We know from experience that the British used partition as a convenient shortcut to solving problems, but they failed everywhere. Palestine, as you must have heard in the morning, Ireland, as we know from history, and certainly in the case of India. And any opinion poll carried out in Pakistan that I have seen has said that the Muslims of the subcontinent were better off without a partition. Because what partition really did is partition Muslims. So about the past, was partition a mistake? About the present, is democracy a silver lining? And finally, do you have a bullet, or a magic mantra, or a silver bullet for the future? I'll ask the other questions later, but Sally, would you like to begin?
Okay, I'll start on the promoting democracy idea. I think it's a fabulous idea to think that we could have democracies all over the world because, in theory, democracies don't go to war against each other. But I do think it's wishful thinking. I think when I look at Afghanistan, for example, it's difficult. I sometimes wonder if democracy is actually inimical to the whole Afghan way of life and culture and society. And I think, we have to distinguish between the situation in Kabul and the situation in rural Afghanistan, for example. I think in Kabul we can safely say that the majority of people probably do favour democracy, would like to vote, would like equal rights for women, would like, the civil liberties that we associate with democracy. I think the situation in the Afghan countryside is profoundly different from that. And I think whilst perhaps we can either transplant or negotiate a democratic regime into Kabul, which recognises all of those universal rights and liberties, that it's much harder to assume that we can place such a system of governance in the villages of rural Afghanistan. And I think it's probably impossible, actually. And I think it's always been the situation that, Afghanistan, people refer to the area that President Karzai rules as Kabulistan, of course, because his writ extends only a very short way beyond the capital. So I think that whilst we in the West regard democracy as a universal system, I think many people who don't live in the West, and particularly people who live in the Islamic world, in my experience, and talking specifically about the Islamic world, in the same way that to us democracy is an article of faith, to many Muslims the belief that Islamic law is the superior, the best, in fact the only way of living and having your social, religious, political and legal structures is an article of faith. And it's very difficult, I think, for us to get our heads around that Pakistani Muslims or Afghan Muslims don't see democracy as the cure-all, and to them the starting point would have to be a system that's, that enshrines Islamic law.
Do you want to pass on the other questions? Or?
I definitely want to pass on the other questions, yes.
Samina.
Okay, where do you want me to start?
Was partition a mistake?
I thought that's where we will start. I think it's a wrong question because I'm looking at it not as someone of Pakistani background, but as someone who is looking at international politics. A lot of divisions have happened around the world. States have been created or carved out, and then they've moved on to relate to each other. Even in case of Pakistan, Pakistan got divided into East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh, and Pakistan now inherits the mantle of the old Pakistan. But I think the question that you're asking reflects exactly what I was talking about in terms of the Indian perception of Pakistan, that it was a mistake. Because every time I go to India, I come across some of these references. At one level, you could say that if all the Muslims were in the united India today, there would be a bigger force, and so democratic system in India would have a stronger Muslim voice, and so therefore the position of all the Muslims would be better. But I think if we get hung up on that argument, what we'd miss out on is the world we live in today, how do we deal with that? So I think let's leave that argument behind and say, was it a mistake or not, and know that Pakistan exists, know that Pakistan was broken up,
not just simply because of Indian involvement, but because of Pakistani own mistakes. And we have Bangladesh and other states who are there. So let's start working with the states as they exist and see how we can make sure that they work better and they develop some sort of an identity which exists at one level and can transcend the national boundaries. Okay, the next question, democracy. Just to continue from where Sally was saying, I don't think we should sort of use democracy as something being different from Sharia, because I think if you look at Muslims in general around the world, there is a lot of discussion that talks about representation among Muslims, and it picks up ideas from Western democratic notions. But I would sort of switch the question again and say, what we should really be asking is not democracy as purely defined in terms of just holding elections, because that opens up the space for corruption and manipulation and really people coming to power who don't carry the weight and responsibility of representing the community. I think we need to talk about the question of representation. So any system that gives space to the voices of different people, of different religious, cultural, ethnic backgrounds, gives them space to voice it so that they can be heard, is the solution. And again, we can't be sure that because they're democratic systems, we'd all be loving each other, but at least it would be a start in the sense that the negativity that weakens the system itself, and in this case particularly Pakistan, that would be taken care of. So I would say leave democracy, move more in terms of representation and the right to be consulted.
Robin, the magic mantra.
One word, trade maybe. Trade maybe, 2 words, trade maybe. If you turned loose the Indian bourgeoisie as it's being kind of unleashed now, and if a Pakistan bourgeoisie, middle class, trading class, commercial class, were to grow and flower, and you were to reduce some of the problems on the border of trans-border traffic of the kind Christopher's talked about, then I think you might maintain a kind of 2 political bulldogs barking at each other, while the mice, well, this is the wrong metaphor, I'm with dogs and cats and mice. The cats would fight while the mice played, the mice being the people who would trade across borders and begin to build systems across the India-Pakistan border that were based on mutual interests of people selling goods to each other, while governments might maintain an antagonistic position. That would be one possibility. And I mean, you would have a far better idea, having lived in the area, of just how realistic more permeable borders might become in the longer term.
I would agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that it's just bloody-mindedness on the part of a section of the Indian bureaucracy, which disallows India from making unilateral concessions to its neighbors on questions of trade. 70% of Pakistan's exports are textiles, and which have a complete ban in terms of being exported to, imported into India. If I was the Prime Minister, I would unilaterally create a lobby for India in Pakistan by opening up textile imports. But there's several other areas, and I agree with you. I think if you have to look for a way out, it's by building these stakeholders within within Pakistan, within all these countries. And this would be potentially a silver bullet.
Certainly, the reports one hears of people-to-people exchanges are all very positive. An Indian delegation goes to Pakistan, can't pay for anything. The cricket diplomacy earlier this year, last year, was very warm and welcoming. Journalists were taken into people's homes and so on. So the people-to-people stuff seems to work pretty well at the moment. If there were more of it with tangible rewards, as there would be from commercial transactions, that would be a huge plus. But
I'll get back to you, Samina, in a minute. But Christopher, I would, since you focused on the macro, one issue which is often raised in India and elsewhere is, does India really need to make peace with South Asia? And a large section of Indians, and especially influential Indians, think that given how intractable the conflicts within South Asia have become, it's probably prudent to bypass South Asia, and that you can do so without great costs. Would you agree with that view? Or?
Can I just answer the first two questions?
Okay.
I won't talk about partition because it's a fact and I think we just have to live with it. That said, even if they hadn't have had partition, there would have been other problems that would have arisen which may have still led to the division of South Asia. In terms of democracy, I think Samina's right, as long as they have some form of representation. It may be a lawyer jirga, it may be a parliament, it may be something else. But I think more important than democracy is actually education. We need to encourage the education of all of the people of South Asia. I think that's a major, apart from their health and well-being, the education is a major issue, male and female. And in terms of a mantra, one of the best mantras I have ever heard was on a Judy Horacek cartoon which said, "We want instant gratification, when do we want it? Now." This should be the mantra for the people of South Asia. We want better international relations, when do we want them? Now. Nothing's going to happen in terms of the Kashmir dispute or anything else in South Asia until the people jump up and down and get their representatives, elected or otherwise, to say, you've got to sort out some of these issues, including Kashmir, including water, including whatever it is, and get on with it. In terms of South Asia, history suggests that India and Pakistan can live quite comfortably having very poor relations. They've done so since 1947. Trade has been minimal. They've had wars. People-to-people contact occurs, but it's very much members of the elite. The average Indian and the average Pakistani are never likely to meet. It's too difficult to get from one country to the other if you can get a visa to start off with, and it's just not encouraged. So, yes, it would be wonderful if all of these things could be resolved, but quite clearly they can get along without having good relations, and India's developing economically without having Pakistan on board. It would be better for Pakistan and the other nations if they could piggyback onto Indian economic development, but I don't think it's an important factor.
I agree with you on education, but we need to be a little cautious about that. Remember that none of the 9/11 hijackers went to a madrasa. All of them were engineers, went to secular, often Christian schools, and had the greatest amount of exposure to the West. So radicalization is not necessarily a function of where you go to school. Samina, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the people-to-people relations, and I think one aspect that probably links to what I was talking about in terms of diasporic engagement is that diaspora has the possibility of actually going back into India and Pakistan and provide the connection. But what seems to be developing is that while the relation between the people from India and Pakistan moving across the borders go through sort of starts and stops, it's the diasporic community that's also being exposed to that same pressure. Because since David Headley's case, what I've noticed is that Indians and Pakistanis, even if they carry passports of another country, for Indians to go to Pakistan, or Pakistanis, somebody like me carrying an Australian passport, to go to India requires so much paperwork that it actually undermines the willingness of people to contribute to that people-to-people interaction. I think if we're really talking about people diplomacy, it has to be a global people's diplomacy. And in that, it's a responsibility of the leadership on every side to make sure that the space for people to engage in that is made available and not reduced, accepting still that there may be cases in which some of the very educated could be a problem, but I think we shouldn't cover everyone with the same brush. So.
Is there anything that any one of you might want to raise with your fellow panelists, or should we?
I'd like to know what my fellow panellists think about the likelihood of Pakistan and India going to war again over Kashmir, because we constantly read that the two countries are on the brink of war. Not constantly, but from time to time they seem to be on the brink of war. I mean, what would it take for those two countries to go to war again? And is there much prospect of that? Or does it just suit them both to be on that brink all the time? Is that almost a permanent state of affairs?
There's a very sobering piece in the Times of India Sunday edition this week by somebody who's the director of the Land Warfare Centre in India, basically saying it's time the world sorted out Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and India should be prepared to offer troops if the world decided it wanted a very provocative kind of peace. But that's coming out of a reasonably senior Indian military person, and there'll be a powerful lobby in the Indian Defence Forces that say, if another November 2008 happened, the Mumbai Taj Hotel massacre, if that happens again, there should be a very fast and very violent Indian military response. Now, there'll be a lobby also saying, look, this is madness, because if that response comes, there's every chance Pakistan will use its nuclear weapons. But those discussions are definitely going on both sides of the border, I think. So, yeah, I think The Economist is quite right. It's the most dangerous border in the world.
But it sounds like Kashmir is perhaps less of a flashpoint now than, the role of, Pakistan Islamist militants in India.
I think Kashmir is not likely to be the trigger. The trigger would be another Mumbai for that kind of a scenario.
I think it's highly unlikely they'll go to war over Kashmir. I think Robin's right, it would be something else. The whole Kashmir dispute, there's a lot of spin in this. India has claimed Jammu and Kashmir since 1947 in its entirety, but knows very little about what it calls Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which term is problematic because sometimes they're talking about Azad Kashmir, occasionally they're talking about the northern areas now called Gilgit-Baltistan, and they lump them all together, and it is...
Could we have number 9, please, on the screen? Might be a help.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Yeah, and the Indian knowledge of so-called Pakistan-occupied Kashmir is minimal. They know nothing about it, and they don't really want it because it's full of, particularly in Azad Kashmir, Muslims who don't want to be part of India. On the other side, one of the real negatives in terms of coming up with a solution is the Pakistan army. It has a vested interest in ensuring that conflict continues, because if you solve that issue, they're not going to need 600,000 men in the army as they've got at the moment. And General Musharraf's stance was quite extraordinary, really, because he comes from that was his constituency, the Pakistan army. In terms of an actual solution, I go back to your point about the West and others, including India and Pakistan, who in this case are acting like Occidentals. They're trying to impose a solution on the people of Jammu and Kashmir, who have never, in any way, shape, form, inclusively or meaningfully, been asked what they want in terms of the international status for Jammu and Kashmir. And what India and Pakistan, I believe, should do is step back, because they can't resolve it themselves, history has shown that, and they should say, OK, people of Jammu and Kashmir, you go freely across the line of control, have discussions, keep on having discussions for as long as it takes, and you come up with a solution or a solution to the problem, and then come back to us and we'll try and accept that. And if that means independence, so be it, but I don't think that would be a workable solution. The people of Jammu and Kashmir need to think seriously about that. But I don't think there's going to be a war over it, because everybody's essentially happy with what they've got. If there was going to be a war, it would have been in Kargil in 1999, when there was that limited exchange called a war because there were more than 1,000 casualties. But surprisingly, it was a year after India and Pakistan confirmed their nuclear capabilities, and it didn't go nuclear. So they can fight a conventional war without it going nuclear.
Shamina, you want to... Sorry.
I was just going to say, it seems to me, and I'd be interested to know if you agree with me, that Pakistan, in a sense, has an interest in maintaining the conflict in Kashmir and maintaining the status quo there, because it's been such a useful training ground for them, particularly since the US invasion of Afghanistan and the removal of Taliban. They basically transferred all the training camps, didn't they? And of course, I mean, there were training camps anyway in Pakistani-occupied Kashmir for a lot of time, and that was essentially the breeding ground for LET and the various other terrorist groups that have become so close to Al-Qaeda and such a threat, well, not only to people in the region but in the West.
Yeah, that and southern Punjab is apparently also one of the places where, southern Punjab on the Pakistan side is also a place where people like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed apparently also have training camps. The Indians have identified anything up to 40 training camps, both in Azad Kashmir and in nearby parts of what used to be called the Northwest Frontier, but which is now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And after the earthquake, if anybody was in doubt that there'd been militant camps in Azad Kashmir, the first group of organisations that were able to offer support to the people of Azad Kashmir, and there were 75,000 people killed in that earthquake, were actually these so-called terrorists who were very well organised and were on the spot. So they are there. But the issue for Pakistan is they're very reluctant to transfer forces away from that border with India, to the other side, to the western side. And some of those folk, like the Lashkar-e-Toiba, have actually gone over there and established links with the Taliban and/or Al-Qaeda.
Samina, you have the last word before we open it to the audience.
Okay, I was just going to say we need to distinguish between a conflict that starts because the military or the leadership on both sides decides that things have come to a point where they have to have a conflict, which was the 1960s model or the 1971, or the one where some inadvertent or a breakaway group's action pushes one or the other, in this case India, to engage in a conflict and push Pakistan into getting involved in that military conflict afterwards. I think it's the second variety that's more likely, and it wouldn't be because everyone, either on Indian or Pakistani side, is willing to engage in a conflict, because the discussion of conflict and the need to teach Pakistan a lesson, or even on Pakistani side, to have a short-range missile which is going to take care of the cold start project from India. Despite those discussions, I think there's been another process that's gone on, that is of the people-to-people relationship, as we were talking, and the need to cooperate with each other. And even within the defense establishments, at least in Pakistani side, I'm aware that there are people who are very conscious of the fact that in a future conflict, Pakistan may not have God on his side. So those factors are going to undermine the real possibility of the states going to a conflict. But inadvertent conflict, I think it is quite possible. Now, in terms of Lashkar-e-Toiba and other groups that you're talking about, I think, again, what it indicates to me is that it's an indirect way of the Pakistan military saying that they are not willing to fight a war. They'd rather have these groups fight it. But once again, I'd point out that we need to now move on to a different understanding of these groups. They're not necessarily always under the direct control of the military agencies anymore. They're in the same space as Al-Qaeda was at the end of the last century. They have achieved at some level an ability to act independently, even against the wishes of those who have been supporting them. So that's something that I think the Indian and others would have to understand. And so every time something happens, which I'm right, I agree with you, Robin, that something like 2008 could again trigger that. But we have to understand that the sins of a few should not be used by any side to really punish the majority of the Pakistanis who actually don't agree with this. Because I think in this whole picture, what we forget is that Pakistanis are suffering.
So I'll have to stop you there because we have a limited amount of time. So could I have questions from the audience? Gentlemen here.
Thank you. I think most Australians are surprised by the religious, nationalistic and political fervour that goes on in these countries we've been talking about. And I think historically, a lot of countries around the world have manipulated the lower socioeconomic groups by having wars, by having this sort of infighting and so on. I think that the only way you're going to solve these problems is to radically alter the socioeconomic conditions of the lower economic groups in these countries. Now, you may say that's going to be very difficult, and I think it is, but you've only got to look what China has done in the last 10 or 15 years to improve economic conditions for a lot of people. And I think if the people in these countries were more satisfied with their lives, they wouldn't need some organisation to give them some sort of position in the community. I just wonder, that hasn't been mentioned, the sort of socio-economic conditions in these countries.
I think that's a fair comment. I may invite you to react to that later, but could we have another question? Yes, please.
Thank you. An Islamic Australian woman remarked last year that the least worst likely outcome for Afghanistan would be for the Taliban to take over. unpalatable as that may be. Could you comment? Perhaps Sally Neighbour might be the best person to start with.
So I missed the start of that question. I think you were telling us who it was who had said
the least worst likely outcome in Afghanistan would be a Taliban takeover of the country.
And who was making that point?
It was an Islamic Australian woman.
I think a Taliban takeover is certainly a very real possibility. I think, as I said before, the gains that have been made in Afghanistan are very patchy and uncertain and quite likely unsustainable. The Taliban certainly at this point, is the most effective military force in Afghanistan. We are attempting, or Australia and its allies are attempting to build up the Afghan National Army to be able to withstand the Taliban. It's debatable whether that will happen. I don't think it's the least worst. I think, we saw some of the atrocities that were carried out under the Taliban regime previously, and also simply the appalling failures to address socio-economic and, human and living standards and education and health and welfare and so forth. So I think, a return to power by the Taliban would not be a good result, but it's one that we have to acknowledge as a possibility. And if it appears to be heading that way, then I think at some point, other players have to start engaging with the Taliban in order to ensure that any future Taliban regime is not as terrible as the previous one was.
There's one factor about the Taliban. They were a nasty, brutal regime, but they did do one thing for Afghanistan. They did give it a period of peace and stability, albeit very male-dominated. And you've got to remember that Afghanistan has had turmoil since late 1979. Apparently most Afghans are not in favour of the Taliban coming back, which is a very positive thing. The other thing is it may revert to the way it was before the Taliban came into power, with the Northern Alliance re-emerging, the non-Pashtun elements in the north, the Dostum in Uzbekistan and the Shah Massoud type element in the other part in the Tajik area. So it's not a guarantee that the Taliban would come back or would control all of Afghanistan.
Thank you. I'll come back to you, Samina, but I'm quite intrigued by this mushrooming of born-again Taliban supporters in the West. If that's the least worst, what's the worst? Osama bin Laden as the new president, or his reincarnation?
He's presumably dead, isn't he?
Yeah, or his reincarnation, if you believe in Hindu philosophy. But frankly, I think it's just making a virtue of necessity, given the fact that most of the ISF members want to pull out, and you're not going to defeat the Taliban, you might as well make peace with them. It's really not the least worst. In my understanding, it's probably the worst outcome that you can possibly have in Afghanistan is the return of the Taliban, good, bad, or the ugly. Okay. Gentleman with the red shirt.
Thanks. Samina, I have a question about, you were talking about identity and how identity is partly formed by our schooling. And I'm wondering about the education in Pakistan. I've heard or read that in recent years, Saudi Arabia has provided a lot of funding for schools that have been set up in Pakistan, which teach according to a very, the Saudi Arabian form of Islam, which I understand is sometimes referred to as Wahhabi. It's sometimes described as a desert-based form of Islam, which is quite contrary to the traditional historical form of Islam in that region. I'm just wondering if you can tell us, is this true? How significant is it? How big, how influential is that Saudi investment in education, and whether there's other alternative forms of education that might be possible for Pakistan?
Thank you very much. I think in terms of Saudi funding for schools, it's actually not a new phenomena, because even in the 1980s, you would see schools, and especially madrasas that were training jihadis to go into Afghanistan, who received funding from the Saudi Arabians. But then in the 1990s, the struggle between the Iranians and the Saudis also led to Saudis funding. But currently, I think when we talk about problem of education, it's more than just the Saudi-funded schools or madrasas. It's what I often refer to is the proliferation of trashy information about what it means to be a Muslim. And I don't mean to sort of be derogatory, even though I am being derogatory, but there's so much stuff that gets published which picks up on Wahhabi reading without really being true to Wahhabi reading, which is promoted in local languages, especially in Urdu, black and white, which people pick up, and they don't have to go to Saudi-funded schools to get those ideas. But even if we were just focusing on the schools and say what kind of schooling is available, Saudi funding is at the same time paralleled by other agencies coming in or other countries coming in. Turkish schools are picking up in Pakistan. And then a lot of civil society people who are from different backgrounds and not all into the Islamic language, they are also trying to promote education. But I think the real problem in Pakistani education is we either have government schools or we have madrasas, religious schools, or we have got private funded English medium of instruction. And it's that English medium of instruction schools that I think could create a lot more problems for Pakistan, because those kids don't live in Pakistan. They live in another country, which is not even overseas. And I think in the long term, it's going to be risky for Pakistan because you would have multiple identities of people being in Pakistan, ruling Pakistan, but not being of Pakistan. And that's a bigger problem than Saudi funding. But Amitabh, if I could just sort of echo what you had said about Taliban, I know that there's a logic about accepting Taliban and negotiating, but I think we forget that if Taliban actually come back to power, what kind of language that would introduce into the region. Post-Soviet withdrawal, the developments were seen as authenticating the fact that a small group can defeat a superpower, which led to groups like Lashkar. If Taliban come back, then it's going to reinforce the feelings of Pakistani Taliban, and then it is a cross-border connection. So while I'm all for saying explore all the possibilities, I think there is also a danger in there. So.
It's time for just one last question. The lady there, yes. Yes.
My question is about the role of the diaspora and people-to-people contact. Forgive me for what may be some naivety. I was talking to an Indian man a little while ago who's living in Australia. He'd been living here 2 years, and we were discussing the nature of debate about international affairs in Australia. And I asked him how he enjoyed living here, and he replied that he works for a taxi company. He's from the Punjab, the Indian Punjab, and in the taxi company there's a large number of people from the Punjab, both Pakistan and India. And he said he finds living in Australia enormously exciting because they understand one another. He said our culture is more similar to one another than mine is to other parts of India. So my question is, how representative is this sort of experience? And what more can Australia do to foster and perhaps publicise these sorts of experiences? And what influence might they have in improving relations?
Thank you. Let me just give you a final opportunity in the next 2 minutes, 20 seconds each, Sally, to respond to that or any other question that you may have had.
Okay,
Or you can just pass.
I think Samina is far better responding to that one, but I could just respond briefly to the point that was made before about the need for socio-economic, support and funding and so on. I think, as one of the other panellists made the point previously, the role of socio-economic deprivation in the breeding of terrorists has been exaggerated. As it was said, none of the 19 9/11 bombers were from poor rural families. So that it has been exaggerated, the extent to which socio-economic funding and support and programs and so on would reduce radicalisation. But I think there are so many other reasons for doing that whether or not it leads to more or fewer terrorists, I think, is immaterial. That as much money as possible should obviously be going into education, health, welfare and so on for numerous other reasons.
Thank you, Sally. Samina?
I think what you experienced probably is quite a common phenomena. I'm sure Amitabh would agree with this. A lot of people say that Pakistanis and Indians tend to be the best of friends outside India and Pakistan, which is different from some other communities. But I do think that there is a process when people come in as initial immigrants, that they do tend to look for people that are like them. So in that, the differences are overlooked. But I am concerned, and especially looking at Australia, that as a new generation of Pakistanis and Indians grow up here, that as an academic who teaches young people, I do notice just a small sign of it, but I think that's worrying, where identification with the hardcore policies of the either country are voiced. And I think that's something that those of us who are not in that frame need to make sure that we start responding to that.
Robin?
I currently work in Singapore, and the Singapore government next month in July is running a South Asian Diaspora Convention intended to bring together the big bourgeoisies of the South Asian countries with just this kind of purpose, that the big commercial people meeting on a neutral ground like Singapore will find both the sorts of fellowship that we've talked about here, but also genuine interests that will reinforce that fellowship. Now, that's a Singapore government initiative. If it's successful or looks promising, there'd be every reason for an Australian government to look at doing something rather similar, bringing South Asian diasporas together for particular social networking and ultimately trade networking.
Christopher?
In terms of the education, I think it is important for two reasons. While some of these folk who've been involved in Mumbai and other things are educated, there are a hell of a lot of people involved in so-called terrorist organisations in Pakistan, in the frontier, in Afghanistan and certainly in Azad Kashmir who are the members of society who aren't terribly well educated. In general as well, the levels of ignorance in India about Pakistan and vice versa in Pakistan about India are astronomical, and the educations that both are getting, particularly in Pakistan, are fairly stilted and limited, and it would be, they don't have the opportunity to have people-to-people contact except in places like Australia, and as long as you don't mention a controversial issue like Kashmir, they'll get on fabulously, and they do. But locally they have very limited ways of accessing one another, which is why education might actually help to bridge that gap, unless you're prepared to get rid of the borders, which would also be a very good thing to do.
Thank you very much, Christopher Snedden, Robin Jeffrey, Samina Ahmed, and Sally Neighbour. Samina Yasmin and Sally Neighbour, thank you very much, and thank you, all of you. Thank you.